what we're gonna do now is make maple spread or maple cream. So I have a different wire to measure my syrup. I'm gonna put that on the edge of the kettle. I'll get my hose from over here. Stick it in there. So our syrup level is just about to where it needs to be. And I'm gonna shut this off. Turn my kettle on. I'm just draining the hose so that it doesn't go all over. And then I'm going to add my defoamer, commercial defoamer. So then we just have to wait again. The maple spread we're going to cook to, actually it's the same temperature, 240, well actually it's higher, 248 degrees, because I'm also going to pull a half gallon of syrup from a drum that is completely inverted. Okay, so let's talk about inverted sugars for a minute. Sap comes out of the tree as 100% sucrose. When we've been talking about the different invert levels, it changes, or it breaks down into glucose and fructose. Bacteria in the tree can do that, or in the lines as you're boiling, or in your sap tank. So here at Merle Maple, we tend to make syrup that's about 2% inverted. So we've got 2% glucose in our final product. When we make maple sugar candies, we want it to be less than 0.5%, so we buy that syrup from other producers who have a lower glucose level. So for maple cream, we can have up to 5% inverted syrup or glucose in our syrup. Therefore, with the maple spread, what we want to do is we're going to take a half gallon of syrup that's completely inverted. Now we found that if you cook that, it gets a really strong taste. So we don't actually cook it with our other 2.5 gallons. So I'm going to draw a half gallon of syrup out from a drum that's completely inverted. What I've done with that is we take a drum, take a little syrup out, and then we add a cup of invertase. Invertase is an enzyme. It's used as a process aid, or in New York State it's considered a process aid, because once I cook the rest of the syrup and add it to the inverted syrup, the invertase, any that's left, is killed off. Once you get above 150 degrees, that enzyme is killed off. It's no longer there. So it's not actually in the, it kind of goes away. So I'm going to take the 100% inverted drum. I take a half gallon out, and that way we add it to our 2.5 gallons later, and it ends up being a 3-gallon batch. Okay, so this is my 30-gallon drum. This is just a low-end amber, high-end amber, low-end golden syrup that we inverted. I added a cup of invertase to this drum on the 31st of January. We put a drum barrel warmer on it for about 24 hours, heated it to 100 degrees, and just let it sit, so that the invertase would invert all of the sugars in this drum. So it's all converted from sucrose to glucose and fructose. And it's the glucose that we can measure with the either glucosometer, like for blood glucose sugar, the handheld, or the YSI bioanalyzer. Okay, so I'm just gonna take out a half a gallon. And I'm gonna stick it in my bowl. And now, like I said, we don't want to cook this, but I am going to warm it. I'm going to warm it to between 100 and 150 degrees. And that is just so that when I add the syrup to it that I've cooked to 248 degrees, it's not quite as much of a shock. Because sometimes when you shock syrup like that, you can get crystal formulation, and we don't want that. So I am going to put this in my water bath over there. Okay, so I'm just going to put this in the water bath. And this will warm up to between 100 and 150 degrees. And it's just the 100% inverted syrup while I'm cooking my 2.5 gallons of syrup over here. So together it's going to be a 3-gallon batch, a half gallon not cooked, 2.5 gallons cooked to 248 degrees. And again, that's a higher temperature to compensate for that half gallon not being cooked at all. It's bubbling a little, but it's not going over. By putting cold water on the outside of this, it takes some of the heat out of it, and that helps. Okay, so the kettle is getting close to 248 degrees, so I'm going to check the temperature of my inverted syrup. It's 132 degrees, so that's good. So I'm just going to get this ready and put it over here. So this is just warmed, it hasn't been cooked, and as soon as this hits 248, we'll dump it in there, and then I'll carry it to the cooler and let it sit. We want it to cool completely, so I always let it sit all overnight because again, it's sitting in a cold water bath. The outside will be cold, but the inside will still be hot. So we let it sit overnight so it gets down to 40 degrees at night or overnight. Okay, we're at 248, so I'm going to turn off my kettle and dump it into the bowl. So again, the reason for warming the inverted syrup is just so that we don't shock it quite so bad, because it's mixing very well in the bowl, but this way it is warm to begin with and isn't quite as, it's better than taking it out at 40 degrees and adding something that's 248 to it. All right, so now I'm going to carry it to the cooler. All right, so I'm going to set this here. Normally there's not quite as much ice in here as there is today, but it'll be all right, it'll melt. And I'm just going to spritz the top. Well, stay there. Stay. I'm going to spritz the top of it, just that way, so we don't get crystal formation on the top. All right, so we're going to go to the back of the cooling pan. Let's try that again. A little more spritzing. I like to do it until the water kind of glides across the top, just a little. You don't want to put too much on there, but otherwise you get crystal formation. So then, after it has set for 24 hours, or till the next day, it'll look about like this. So I'm going to bring this pan out. It's just clear taffy. You know, sometimes if there's crystals in there, you'll see a light colored blob. There's no crystals in this one. There's a very few on top, but it's good to go. I'm going to take it out and put it in that hot water bath where the inverted syrup was and warm up just the outside of the pan. It'll be in there for maybe a minute and a half, and then just enough so that it tips in the pan. Therefore I can dump it into my cream machine. Okay, so before I add the cold taffy to the hopper, I'm going to add what we consider seed, which is just a jar of maple cream or maple spread off the shelf. What it does is, crystallization is a catalytic process. So by putting this in here, it gets the crystallization process started with the spread. And this machine it's similar to the sugar machine. You could use the sugar machine, you just don't want it hot. And since we use that already today, we don't want to use that machine. But it has a hopper on top, no water jacket, and so it's cold, it's room temperature, and but it has a gear pump on it, and it's just going to pump the taffy down through the pump and then back out this tube. But it doesn't necessarily need to be down in the hole, it just needs to be in the machine, and the taffy will pull it down in with it. So we're going to put this bowl of taffy in the hot water just for a minute to a minute and a half, and I don't necessarily time it, I just let it sit there. I'm going to add a little more water, and then you can tell when it starts warming up around the outside. You just want the outside of the bowl to warm up. You don't want the whole thing to warm up, but just enough so that it'll move in that bowl, which is why it's important that the water be a little higher than it was, so that it comes all the way up to the edge. There, now you can see it's moving pretty good. Back and forth in that bowl. So it'll slide out now. So now I'm going to carry it over to the machine. Okay, so here goes into the machine. It'll take it a minute to come out of the bowl. But that's okay. You want it to be really cold yet. Get a little of that taffy down, thinner taffy down in the machine. There we go. So now the pump will actually suck it down through, even though it's that thick, and send it back up the pipe. This first batch always takes the longest to do. So by the gear pump sucking in the taffy, it, well, pushed out a little bit of, there we go. Sometimes it has a hard time getting started, and that's why I'm using this spoon to try and push it down into the pump. So even though it was coming out and it was quite clumpy and hard, now it's nice and smooth, and it just took a little time. Sometimes, like I said, you just have to be patient with it and let the pump do its thing. So now I'm just gonna fill my jars. I'm gonna refill this one that I emptied earlier because there's still nothing wrong with it. So we'll just put that back on the shelf because that's the pound of seed that I took out in the beginning. And then we'll just go to filling jars. We're using our bottling line just to take the conveyor to just take them away from where I'm filling, and then they go down the line and go to a collection table, and that way somebody else can either come along or I can box them up when we get done, and then we just put them in the cooler, store them in there. Like I said, the crystallization process actually finishes within the next 24 to 48 hours, and then but the product can go out at any time. It's not like the sugar that has to sit. But we know that crystal form changes over time.